And welcome back. It's that time of year where we go through the traditional, or a look at the traditional Thanksgiving. And this is the time of year we actually challenge you to actually look at what the first Thanksgiving really was as a nation. You have to understand that there were 13 independent and sovereign nations, and each of them had their own traditions. And we are going to challenge the fact of, what was the first Thanksgiving to be true? What we have to do is we have to look at the historical side of things. But I just want you to understand that what we're doing here is not to necessarily insult family tradition. It's to challenge what the purpose of this holiday is. I have said many times before, if you look at all of the holidays we celebrate, the most righteous holiday this nation celebrates is Thanksgiving. Christmas is really more of a hodgepodge of what do you want to call it? It's not Puritans. It starts with the P, pagan. Christmas is a pagan holiday that was enveloped into, or I should say Christianity kind of was laced and intertwined with these pagan rituals, pagan holiday that was very problematic. So we're going to get into that on Christmas. Help the family start to understand that how would we be as a nation if instead of having football and gorging ourselves with food and so forth and thanking for our, the good things of the year, the blessings of the year, and pray that the next year is equally good? Or maybe what we should be doing is what the framers intended in our very first Thanksgiving under the Constitution for the United States. So anywho, let me see, I got a minute and a half, so I'm going to go ahead and dive into the first Thanksgiving, or what we believe to be, that's right, what we believe to be the first Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims who celebrated Thanksgiving in America were fleeing from religious persecution. I think most people kind of understand the backstory, but most people really understand what happened after they got here. A lot of people don't know what it was that led to their coming here. Just so you can understand that there was indentured servitude, if you want to call it slavery, in every single colony to one form or another. So this is why we want to give you this glimpse of American history. So the Pilgrims who celebrated Thanksgiving in America were fleeing religious persecution in England. In 1609, a group of pilgrims left England for the religious freedom in Holland. They lived and prospered. After a few years, though, their children started speaking Dutch and became attached to the Dutch way of life. I guess they like those wood clog shoes. Anyway, this worried the Pilgrim. Back to a historical perspective of the Pilgrim Thanksgiving. So on September 6th, or actually, I just jumped over a whole month, or I should say a whole paragraph, and actually several years. So they decided to leave Holland because they were seeing this influence on their children from the Dutch society that they just didn't like. Now you got to understand, the Pilgrims were not very tolerant. The Puritans, I should say, were not very tolerant towards people of different faiths. I mean, if you started branching off, let's say you believed in and you were a part of the Puritan faith and you embraced it, and then you started making any minute changes, you were almost found heretical and were cast out. I mean, that's how some of these other American religions were founded, is because they kind of spawned out of the Puritan area, like the Southern Baptists, the Baptist faith. It was slowly migrated into the Southern Baptist, but the Baptist faith actually came from and was a byproduct of the Puritan faith. But anyhow, so they decided to leave Holland to the New World. Their trip was financed by a group of English investors called the Merchant Adventurers. It was agreed that the Pilgrims would be given passage and supplies in exchange for their work for their backers for 7 years. On September 6th, 1620, the Pilgrims set sail for the New World on this ship that everybody knows as the Mayflower. I actually had, I believe, there was two different, my heritage, I came from two different families that were on the Mayflower. Anywho, they sailed from Plymouth, England, and aboard were 44 pilgrims who called themselves the Saints and 66 others who called themselves who the pilgrims called the Strangers. The long trip was cold and damp, and it took 65 days. Since there was the danger of fire on the wooden ship, the food had to be eaten cold. Many passengers became sick, and one person died by the time land was sighted on November 10th. Now, so who thought it was a good idea to set sail for a northern latitude country in the middle of, or going into the beginning of winter, especially if you didn't have all the stores to, the meats and foods to, sustain you till you could actually break ground and have a harvest in the New World. So anyway, the long trip led to many disagreements between the Saints and the Strangers. After land was sighted, a meeting was held and an agreement was worked out called the Mayflower Compact. Some people have heard of that, or they kind of remember that, which guaranteed equality and unified the two groups. They joined together and they called themselves the Pilgrims. So prior to that, the Puritans were really, and they became the Puritan faith later, but they, for sake of argument purposes, from the Saints and the Strangers, they were all called Pilgrims. Although they had first sighted land off Cape Cod, they did not settle until they arrived at Plymouth, and which was named by Captain John Smith in 1614. So several years before, this spot in the New England area called Plymouth. And so that's where they landed, and it was there where the Pilgrims decided to settle. Plymouth offered an excellent harbor, a large brook offered a source of fresh fish and fresh water, and the Pilgrims' biggest concern was attack by the local Native Americans, but the Puxtons were a peaceful group and did not prove to be a threat. And so we kind of know the rest of the history, but that's what got them there. Most people knew the religious, but most people didn't know that, the majority of the group was really non-believers or non-saints. Anywho, and I think most people know the story of the tragedy of the Commons, how many of the people were stealing. And so right there in the old Puritan capital, in the very beginning, socialism failed, and that was called the tragedy of the Commons. Anyway, the real first American Thanksgiving actually happened in Virginia, and it was actually before the Pilgrims had arrived. So it was like 2 years before the Pilgrims enjoyed their Thanksgiving. Captain John Woodleaf conducts the first American Thanksgiving upon safe arrival in Virginia. And, oh, by the way, it's kind of interesting how the Puritans themselves were founded on indentured servitude all the way up there. On December 4th, or actually, let me just state the obvious, right? Contrary to popular belief, the first American Thanksgiving was in Virginia, not Plymouth, Massachusetts. On December 4th, 1619, after 10 weeks at sea, 38 English settlers arrived at Berkeley, about 20 miles upstream from Jamestown. On that day, Captain John Woodleaf held the first service of Thanksgiving as the newly landed settlers fell to their knees to thank God for their safe arrival. Now, this was in December. December is not a good time to be coming here, especially if you don't have stores. The charter of Berkeley Hundred stated, "We ordain that the day of our ship's arrival at the place assigned for Planticon in the land of Virginia shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God." Thus, the first real American Thanksgiving was held before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth and 2 years before the fabled New England feast. Historians say that the feast at Berkeley 100 may have included bacon, peas, cornmeal, cakes, and cinnamon water. But regardless of the menu to these settlers, the first Thanksgiving was much more than turkey and pumpkin pie. It was all about prayer. After several years, the site became Berkeley Plantation and was the long traditional home of the Harrison family, one of the first families of Virginia. Berkeley Plantation was the birthplace of William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, and Benjamin Harrison, the 5th, signer of the Declaration of Independence. It also was the ancestral home of Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president of the United States. And so I want you to understand that, hey, there was actually a first American Thanksgiving, but it really wasn't about feasting. It was really about prayer. Now, the Pilgrim Thanksgiving was really more of a bountiful harvest and a celebration of a relationship that the Pilgrims were able to create with Squanto, the Native Americans, and so forth. And so as we start looking at, what is it that we're doing, what I want you to see is that America actually had these two regional historical traditions that at the founding. So these traditions were revered at a local level. So as we move forward into the United States, I think that there was a desire by George Washington. And actually, as we get into this, you're going to understand that it was a unanimous call by Congress. And when I say a unanimous call, it was 100% of all the congressmen that were in the first session of Congress all called upon Washington and asked him to create a day, or to proclaim a day of Thanksgiving. And so that proclamation is what we read, and that proclamation was what should be setting the tone for the American, under this constitutional republic, the American Thanksgiving that we all should recognize. So how is it that we all of a sudden created or clung to the Puritan? Now, when most people look, especially the progressives, when they look at spots of history, the Puritans is not something that people look in favor of, but there was a reason why the progressives kind of liked it, because it was the first attempt on American soil of a socialistic government. Everything was to be equally shared. Everybody was to have an equal share of everything produced. And it wasn't until later, after the tragedy of the Commons, where I think it was Bradford was the one that actually said, hey, we're going to make it so that everybody, you can keep your own crops, and we're going to start trading, and everybody, was responsible for feeding themselves. Because they realized that there were too many slackers and not enough producers. And so now the slackers had to actually produce. And thus they curbed the entitlement state after being, I would say, subjected to some real harsh losses of people, harsh winters, and so forth. So, when we look at the history of the Pilgrims and you go, well, why is it that the progressives like that? Well, I can tell you the one thing that they liked about it was the paradigm of everybody being equal and everybody sharing everything. Well, the reality is that as the Puritans grew, they became very intolerant towards heathens. They would cast you out. If you were living there and you started teaching heretical, antithetical doctrine to the Puritan doctrine, you were gone. You were basically kicked out. And guess what? You didn't get your property. You just basically, what you could carry out with you that's all you had, and that's all you got. And so many people had to, I shouldn't say many, but there were at least two cases where I know the two people were kicked out that actually spawned their own new religion. Now, we kind of move forward a century plus into what we call the revolution and into this new 13 independent states and colonies and how we've grown to this. Okay, so we look today at our government. We look today at the paradigm of people. And I have to ask you, how is it that we are now looking at what I would call a Thanksgiving holiday and be attuned to the spirit of what Thanksgiving really meant? Because to be honest with you, to be clear, I do not see this service as to being congruent with what the progressives want. As a matter of fact, I'm just kind of surprised that the woke society hasn't really started attacking the origins of the Puritan holiday. And I think one of the reasons why it's a kind of hands-off is because, well, there were socialistic roots in the first Thanksgiving holiday. I mean, that's when they were celebrating supposedly the perfect society where all people were equal, that all people shared, everybody was, it was an open society supposedly. But it was a society that was destined to be destroyed because of the nature of man, where people, wanted to steal from others and not have to work, where they were enabled to actually have bad behavior. It was only when they shifted their paradigm onto holding everybody accountable for, obtaining what they needed. I don't think there was a point in time where there was, widows or people that were so destitute because of something that they just didn't take care of them. I don't think that was the case. I think those people were brought in because, you can't even tend to your own fire and do back in those days, you had to work to survive. And so shucking some of your responsibilities of growing food and stealing it from the common fields, well, that was a little bit different, which is why Bradford ended up dividing property to say, okay, you get this part. This is yours. And I'm not surprised that, fences and partitions and division was created to protect property. That little fundamental right that we all have in protecting our property, protecting our life. And so when we look at, the Thanksgiving that we have today and this beautiful meal that everybody goes to great lengths to focus on, let's focus on what the framers actually did when they established this new general government that was designed to serve the republic and serve the people. Not in a way of entitlements, not in a way of anything other than securing their rights and protecting them from harm from external forces. So the first Thanksgiving of the United States under the U.S. Constitution was proclaimed by George Washington in his first Thanksgiving proclamation. And it was called Proclamation, a National Thanksgiving. And so, again, I want to point out that this was a unanimous support, unanimous call from both houses of Congress that called upon George Washington, the president, to declare a national Thanksgiving. Whereas it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, to be grateful for His benefits, and humbly to implore His protection and favor. And whereas both houses of Congress have, by their joint committee, requested to me, quote, to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts the many and signal favors, I don't want to say it's flavors, sorry, and signal favors of Almighty God. especially by affording them an opportunity peaceably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Now, what I want to point out here it is that he's also laying out, because first off, it was recommended, and the first thing he says is that it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits and protection, and implore his protection and favor. And then he gets into this, this fact that the Almighty God afforded them the opportunity to create with, having peace at this point in time, to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness, something that protected their inalienable rights and their liberties. Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all that is good, that was, that is, or that will be, that we may then unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favor able interpositions of his providence in the course and conclusion of the late war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety, and particularly the national one now instituted for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all the great various favors which he has been pleased to confer upon us. So let's look at this. They didn't have national sports, and actually sporting and competing in the Olympics and those types of things, it just wasn't important. It wasn't there. They didn't allow themselves to be consumed by gratification, by all sorts of, I'll just call them distractions. There may have been some gambling, but it was not like what we see today. And I will tell you, friends, that those times may have been hard, but they were simpler, and it was much easier to stay on the right road. Not that there weren't temptations, I'm sure there were, but not like today. Not like you're being bombarded from every direction, almost everywhere you go, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on TV, whether it's in the media or what have you. There are all sorts of temptations and misinformation to lead us astray. Our education system is actually indoctrinating and endorsing, not only inappropriate, but absolute, sinful manners, sinful behavior that we as a society, as an enlightened society, should never have embraced. We should have actually done everything we can to ensure that everybody was educated on how these things will destroy us. And now it has been unleashed, and we are now looking at our ultimate destruction. So as we look at today, and especially on Thanksgiving Day, with the national football games, the parades, what is it that you consume yourself with on this given day? And let's look at what they called us in this first national holiday that was assigned in the fourth Thursday of November, and it was devoted to the people of the states, that they would give service to the great and glorious being. How do you do that? And so the better piece of information you need to know is, why is it that they called for service instead of gorging on food, instead of having a huge banquet of plenty or anything like that? Why was it that it was a service? Because service is a sacrifice. Sacrifice is how you sanctify and purify something to make sure that it is righteous and good. And so when you receive something, you should, especially when you receive blessings or what have you, and they truly recognize this nation, the establishment of this nation was truly a blessing. Not only a blessing to them, but to they knew it would be future generations would be blessed because of this. So they were so moved to call for a day of service to sanctify, the Constitution, and to sanctify this nation. So before I finish the rest of this, it is time for me to kind of lay it out there. What would this nation be like if once a year we actually took the time to thank him and to serve him like we're supposed to do every Sunday, but actually doing it, setting aside the fourth Thursday of the month of November in the service of him, the being that gave us this nation, that gave us our liberties and secured them as civil rights. Just think about where we would be. So let's kind of close up here, because this is the last segment for today's episode. And so if you're really thinking about it, and as a matter of fact, I would ask you to take this proclamation that I'm reading. This is the last paragraph I've got, but I'd ask you, if it anything else, if you don't play this show for Thanksgiving, print out this proclamation and read it to your family and point out to your family how, as a nation, we started off going in the right direction and how we're not going in the right direction today, because we're not giving thanks and we're not actually sanctifying this nation anymore. We're basically caught up in gluttony and pride and looking at how good we are and it's not about how many people are suffering. It's about the blessings of liberty that we all share. And we need to put that into context. If you want to actually, hit those thugs right in the mouth as to, what they're trying to do to this nation, this very first proclamation, this Thanksgiving proclamation by George Washington, I believe, is a direct blow, because it helps people understand how we got here. It wasn't by coincidence or circumstance that, people survived and created this, union between Indians and so forth. No, it was by the complete blessings and the benefactor who he, our creator, gave us in creating this Constitution. Look at how blessed this nation has been. And look at how blessed this world has been because of this nation. There's lots of people that, look at America's entanglements in some of these wars. But I'm here to tell you that, any good person would have stood up against Hitler. Any good person should have stood up against Stalin, should have stood up against Lenin, should have stood up against Mao. We should have been in more wars against these ultimate communist fascist states that were created in the wake of what happened from World War II, and actually what happened from World War I. And if you really look at it, it all began in Germany with Otto Bismarck establishing socialism in Germany as the first nation of the modern era, that it created an entitlement state that destroyed it economically. It was that forced Germany to start taking drastic measures of expanding and reaching and crossing lines that led to that war. Germany would never have been in the position to actually go down that path. It was the true change of fascism and totalitarian statism in the world. So as Washington finishes his final paragraph, he says, and also that we may unite in most humbly offering our prayers and supplications to the great Lord and ruler of nations, and beseech him to pardon our national and other transgressions, to enable us all, whether in public or private stations, to perform our several and relative duties properly and punctually. I have to point out, properly and punctually, to do it on time. How many people do you know are procrastinators and need to be told, you got to be here on time. You got to do these things on time. It's kind of like when you hear people talking about, paying their bills and they get I've never known a person, I've heard of people that have had their lights or their water, their services turned off because they just didn't pay their bills. Come on. What do you expect? Anyway. And that is an entitlement mentality where, how dare you? Anyway, to render our national government a blessing to all the people by constantly being a government of wise, just, and constitutional laws, discreetly and faithfully executed and obeyed, to protect and guide all sovereigns and nations, especially such as have shown kindness to us, and to bless them with good governments, peace and concord, to promote the knowledge and practice of true religion and virtue, and the increase of science among them and us, and generally to grant unto all mankind such a degree of temporal Now,